Good evening, brothers and sisters in the Dhamma. The topic of the talk tonight is the history of Indian Buddhism. To give a talk like this, one has to do some research. So I referred to a few books, and the main book that I used is this book called History of Indian Buddhism by Professor Akira Hirakawa. Why I use this book? Because he is the most popular of the modern scholars on Indian Buddhism. Although he died recently, he is still acknowledged like one of the top scholars, one of the top authorities on Indian Buddhism. Also because he is a Japanese and he has done research on the Chinese books available and also on the Pali books or Sri Lankan books, etc. that are available on the history of Buddhism. So he has compared both Mahayana sources and Theravada sources. So a lot of his, what he says is valued by other scholars. That's why. There's another interesting book by this Professor Rhys Davids. That's the Literature and History of Buddhism. And there are a few others like Warder and all that. But some of those books are a bit old. This one by Professor Hirakawa is comparatively new. Now, he says that it is generally agreed by all or most modern scholars that the Buddha passed away around the year 485 BCE, which is before Common Era, what they used to call BC, before Christ. So some scholars say it is like 483, some say 484, some say 485, 86, like that, but roughly around that time. And they also generally agreed that the Buddha passed away at the age of 80. So if you work backwards, that means the Buddha was born around 565 BCE. He became enlightened at the age of 29, around 530, and then that's correct. And then he passed away at the age of he became enlightened at the age of 35. Yeah, he struggled from 29 years old until 35. And then he passed away at 485 BCE. Now, a lot of people, we have heard that the Buddha was the son of a king because his father was called Raja Suddhodana. But if you read from the suttas, actually, like for example, the Dhammadayana Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, it stated that the king of Kosala is Pasenadi, King Pasenadi. And in that sutta, King Pasenadi came to pay homage to the Buddha and praise the Buddha. And he said that the Buddha is 80 years old, just like he is 80 years old. The Buddha is a citizen of Kosala, just like he is a citizen of Kosala. The Buddha is the warrior caste, just like he is the warrior caste, and all these things. So from there we know that the Buddha was a citizen of Kosala. And so since the country has only got one king, and the king was Kosala, so the Buddha's father was not a king. The Buddha's father was one of many Rajas. Raja means somebody from the royal family, royal, what do you call the blue blood, the warrior caste. So for example, in our country we have many Rajas and Tunkus, and not all of them are Sultans or Agong, right? Only one is picked to be the Sultan or Agong. So in the case also, here Raja Suddhodana is called Raja not because he's king, but because he belongs to the warrior caste. So some people also say that the Buddha's father was the Sakyan chieftain. That also is not true. If we look into the Vinaya books, it is mentioned the first 1060 Arahants who were enlightened. And in there, there is a man called Badya. It is mentioned that the Badya was a Sakyan chief. And he was persuaded by his very good friend Anuruddha to become a monk. And finally, he became a monk. And because his, what we call paramis, were very good, good qualities, within 3 or 4 months, he became enlightened, became an arahant. So we know that the Sakyan chieftain was not the Buddha's father, but Badya. So the Buddha's father was one of many warrior caste persons, but it's also mentioned that his father was very rich, very wealthy. That's why his father built 3 mansions for him for the 3 seasons, for the winter, summer and rain season. So the Buddha, from the Gatikara Sutta, we find that he was a monk before, under the Buddha Kassapa. And in that lifetime, he listened to the Dhamma and understood the Dhamma and renounced. Originally, in that lifetime, he was a Brahmin, having attained understanding of the suttas. That means he must have attained right view and entered the stream and then became a monk. And then after that lifetime, he was reborn in the Tusita heaven and came back as Siddhartha Gautama. And as a small boy, he could enter the first jhana under the jambu tree. So we know that first jhana must have been attained when he was a monk under the Buddha Kassapa. So if he had already entered the stream and attained the first jhana, it is logical to say that he should have become a Sakadagamin, second fruit attainer, second fruit Arya. That explains why when he came back as Siddhartha Gautama, for no good reason, he left his beautiful wife, left his newborn son, and left his loving parents who pleaded and cried, asked him not to go forth. In front of them, he shaved off his head, put on the yellow robe, and walked out of the house. If that happened to an ordinary person, we say xiao le, chi xin jo, something wrong with him. Tiga suku, how can he leave his family like that and go and become a monk, a beggar, and living under the trees at night and all these things and beg for his food and all that. So the only explanation is that he's not an ordinary person. He must have become a Sakadagamin, and then only he renounced. He had to renounce because according to the suttas, when a person becomes a Sakadagamin, he's called a once returner. He comes back as a human being. One last time, he must enter Nibbana. That's why his time was due. That's why he had to go forth. So, at the age of 80, the Buddha passed away. And it is stated that when the Buddha passed away, the Sangha consisted of small groups of beggar monks and mendicants in central India. This central India means, the Pali word is Majjhima Padesa. In Chinese, they translated it as Zhongguo, middle country, Zhongguo. So from there, this misunderstanding arose that all Buddhas are born in China. All Buddhas are not born in China. All Buddhas are born in the middle country or middle India. So through the efforts of Sakyamuni's disciples, Buddhism spread to the south and to the west. It was only later, because of Emperor Asoka, that Buddhism spread far and wide and became a world religion. Now the periods of Indian Buddhism are given as generally as 5 periods. The first one is early Buddhism or original Buddhism. That means the original teachings of the Buddha were practiced. This was roughly for 500 years. From the year the Buddha was enlightened, 530 BCE until approximately 50 BCE, approximately 500 years. This fits very well according to what the Buddha said in the Suttas and Vinaya. Originally, the Buddha did not allow women to go forth as nuns. And later, when he was persuaded many times by Ananda, he finally allowed the ladies to become nuns. But later he told Ananda, he said, Ananda, if today you had not persuaded the Tathagata to allow women to go forth as nuns, the true Dhamma would have lasted 1,000 years. Now the true Dhamma will last only 500 years. So now we see from here, actually the true Dhamma lasted 500 years. It's not that after 500 years there is no more true Dhamma. It's just that after 500 years the Dhamma becomes polluted, mixed with this counterfeit Dhamma, what is known as, what the Buddha calls counterfeit Dhamma, which includes false sutras and all that. So from here we see early Buddhism or original Buddhism lasted from roughly 530 BCE up to 50 BCE. And this includes the time of Emperor Asoka. Emperor Asoka lived around the year 250 BCE. Then the next phase of Buddhism in India is called sectarian Buddhism or Hinayana Buddhism, where there were something like 20 schools of Buddhism, 20 sects of Buddhism. This started around the year 150 BCE, but then it was still not popular yet until about 50 BCE. Then only this sectarian or Hinayana Buddhism became popular until the year around 850 CE, Common Era. That means it lasted about 900, 1000 years like that, 900 years. So this Hinayana Buddhism or sectarian Buddhism is called Xiao Cheng, Xiu Seng in Chinese. And later I explain why it is called that, not original Buddhism. Then the third phase of Buddhism in India begins around the year 100 BCE. That's the time when Mahayana ideas started to surface. Mahayana teaching started to surface. But they only became popular from the year around 10 CE. 10 Common Era. In Chinese we call Gong Yan, Common Era. Around 10 CE up to 200 CE. And then the fourth phase is called later Mahayana Buddhism, which lasted from about 200 CE up to 850 CE. Then the last phase is called esoteric Buddhism. Esoteric Buddhism started around about 600 CE, but they only became popular about 700 CE and lasted up to 1000 or 1001 CE, Common Era. So you find that the last phase is this esoteric Buddhism. Esoteric Buddhism is also called the secret school, where it is transmitted only from the teacher to the disciple, only to select disciples, not to everybody. Now, after the Buddha's time, what happened was, after the Buddha passed away, the Sangha convened the first council a few months after the Buddha's passing. This was called the first council. This council is a translation for the Pali word Samhiti. Samhiti means the monks come together and chant together the Dhamma and the Vinaya. Chanting together, that's the meaning of Samhiti. So this first council was attended by 500 arahants. And remember Ananda being the one most familiar with the suttas because he was beside the Buddha most of the time. He was asked to chant the suttas and then the arahants all memorized what he chanted. The aim was to make sure everybody gets the suttas correct so that it is handed down. Everybody agrees the Buddha said such and such. Instead of everyone having a different version. And then Upali was asked to chant the Vinaya. So the 500 arahants, they have a very good computer up here, and it's chanted just one time, everything memorized. So after that, they transmitted to their disciples, and after that, it was handed down generation after generation, right up to now. So that was the starting point of the suttas and the Vinaya. Then about 100 years after the Buddha's passing away, the monks in a place called Vesali, they were not practicing well. They were not keeping good Vinaya. For example, they were accepting money from lay people, which is against the precepts. And then they were eating after noon. Here noon in Malaysia is about 1 o'clock when the sun is the highest. After that, we are not supposed to allow. We are not allowed to eat ordinary food. Only certain things considered medicinal value that we are allowed. So they were eating afternoon. And then they were breaking other precepts. And they gave the reason that because their teacher, their preceptor were doing it, so they just follow their teacher and their preceptors. So they think nothing wrong because their teachers and preceptors are teaching them like this. So then one day a monk called Yasa came to their place. This Yasa was a very good monk, a very learned monk, and also a very good practicing monk. Not sure whether he's an arahant or not. So when he came to this place and then he went to beg for his food, the people not only offered him food, offered him money also. So he refused to accept. Then the people asked him why. He said the Buddha doesn't allow monks to accept money. Then they say, how come? The monks here tell us that monks can accept money. So he said, no, not allowed. Then another day when he went for Pindapat, other people also offered him money and also he refused. And he again had to explain. So very soon a lot of people came to know that this monk is saying cannot accept money, cannot eat afternoon and all these things. So they start to question the resident monks in Vesali. Why this monk says like that and you all say like this? So the monks are very unhappy in Vesali. So they held a meeting to discuss about this monk, Yasa, who is saying things different from what they say. So they decided expel him, don't allow him to stay here. So they expelled him. So he went away. So he was not satisfied. He went to meet other good monks, other practicing monks, and told them what happened. So they said, we better go and confront these monks. So they started gathering good monks to come and have a whole a meeting with these monks. And when these monks heard that these good monks were coming to find fault with them, they also started to call other monks to come. So finally, they had a meeting, and that meeting 700 monks attended. So when they held this meeting, they started to quarrel with each other. This side says like that side says like that. So there was no end to that quarrel. So finally they decided, okay, what we will do is we will appoint 4 monks from this side and 4 monks from this side. You select 4 respected monks, we will select 4 respected monks, and then the 8 monks decide. So they selected 4 monks, what is written as 4 monks from the east and 4 monks from the west, and these were very well-known and respected Theras, elder monks. So when these 8 monks came together and then they decided on 10 points of Vinaya. These 10 points of Vinaya, whether a monk is allowed to accept money for himself. And they said no. According to the Buddha said in such and such book, in such and such a place, in the Vinaya books, the Buddha said it's not allowed. And then whether a monk can eat in the afternoon, they said no. The Buddha says in such and such a place that we are not allowed to eat in the afternoon. And then whether we should follow our teacher's word all the time, and they said no. If what the teacher says or the preceptor says is in accord with what the Buddha says in the suttas and the Vinaya, then we follow him. But if what the teacher or the preceptor says contradicts the Buddha's words in the suttas and the Vinaya, we don't follow him, we only follow the Buddha. So these 10 points were all voted in favor of the stricter monks. So after that the meeting ended. So the stricter monks, actually there are less of them. The more lax monks, there were more of them. So they were not happy, Later, they held their own meeting and they said they will not accept all these recommendations of the 8 elder monks. They would conduct themselves according to what they like, according to what they prefer. So, in other words, they broke off from these good practicing monks. From here, the first schism started, first schism of the Sangha. The Sangha split into 2 groups. Originally, the Sangha was just one only, but now it's split into 2 groups. This is called the basic schism. In Chinese, they call it the Fen Lie. So, this happened about 100 years after the Buddha's passing away. Now you notice here, these two schools, these 2 sects, the stricter sect is called Theravada. They follow the word of the Thera, the elders. The majority, the other group, where they have more monks, is called the Mahasamghika, because their Sangha is bigger. That's why they're called the Mahasamghika. So in Chinese, the Theravada is called Samchuo Pu or Chang Lao Pai, and the Mahasamghika is called the Ta Chong Pu. You notice here, actually, these 2 groups, the only difference is in the practice of the Vinaya. They still acknowledge that the suttas are the words of the Buddha, the Vinaya are the words of the Buddha, except that they want to practice differently, the Mahasamghika. So, as time went on, slowly, the later monks, after the Buddha's passing away, the Buddha was not there to guide them. They practice less and less. And then when they practice less and less, they talk more and more. They begin to cakap banyak. So have a lot of difference of opinions. So from this difference of opinions, these are like different interpretations of the Buddha's words in the suttas and the Vinaya. So they interpret the Buddha's teachings differently. Then they start to break up into more sects, more schools of Buddhism, different Sangha groups. And then by the time of Emperor Asoka, which was about 200 years later, or 218 years later, there were another 18 sects formed from the original 2. In other words, there were about 20 sects, 20 schools of Buddhism by the time of Emperor Asoka. But since the time of Empress Asoka is only about 200 years after the Buddha's passing away, this was still the time of original Buddhism. They were still practicing original Buddhism. It's just that wrong views start to surface. So, in other words, all of them were following the Pali Suttas and the Vinaya. They acknowledge that the Buddha's original teachings are found in the Suttas and the Vinaya. Okay, now we come to Asoka. According to the Sri Lankan records, the Buddha died in the 8th year of the reign of King Ajatasattu of Magadha. And then the King Ajatasattu's dynasty continued for several generations until the last king was called King Nagadasakara. That means when the Magadha, this dynasty was still strong. So later the Susunaga dynasty started, but lasted a very short time. And then after that the Nanda dynasty started and endured for 22 years. And then in the year 327 BCE, Alexander the Great conquered northwest India. After he conquered into India, there was a lot of disorder. Following the resulting disorder, Chandragupta became king and founded the Mauryan dynasty. He established a strong kingdom over much of India and ruled for 24 years. Then, after Chandragupta, his son was King Bindusara, and this King Bindusara ruled for 28 years. And Bindusara's son was Asoka. Asoka became king in the year 268 BCE. This one, almost all scholars accept this date. Why? Because during the time of Emperor Asoka, he sent missionaries to spread the Dhamma. And he sent missionaries to spread the Dhamma in different countries. And this was recorded in the Asoka pillars. The Emperor Asoka, he constructed stone pillars where the Dhamma was carved out, and also some of the things that happened at that time. So it is mentioned that he sent missionaries to such and such countries, and the kings of the countries were mentioned. So from there, historians, they look and they see such and such a king, such and such a king lived at what time, what year, and then they came to the conclusion that the King Asoka became king in the year 268. So Sri Lankan records say that 218 years passed between the time the Buddha died and the time Asoka became king. But Chinese books say differently. But strangely enough, there is one book in the Chinese records, chronicles. It's called the Ai Wang Chuan, the King Asoka records or King Asoka biography. And there it is stated that from the Buddha's time until Emperor Asoka's time, there were 12 kings of Magadha. Even though the dynasty had stopped, they still had this king. So 12 kings lived from the Buddha's time until the Emperor Asoka's time. Now, just now we mentioned that certain kings, they ruled for 24 years, 28 years, and Asoka himself was king for 36 years. You know, once a person becomes a king, he does not retire, he does not take pension until he dies. Usually that's the case. So that's why most kings, they will rule for 20-something years or 30-something years until they die. That being the case, if 12 kings passed from the time of the Buddha until Asoka, so 200 over years is a reasonable record, but reasonable period. But the Chinese books say only 100 years passed between the time of Emperor Asoka and the Buddha's passing away. In other words, they don't acknowledge that the Buddha passed away around the year 485 BCE. They think it was actually 100 years later, that means around 385 BCE. Now, And one of the reasons they give is that they say when the Buddha passed away, he transmitted his teachings to Mahakassapa. He transmitted his teachings to Mahakassapa. And then Mahakassapa transmitted his teachings to Ananda. And then who transmitted it to Sanakavasi, to Upagupta, to Ditika. So in other words, there were 5 generations of monks from the time of the Buddha's passing away until Asoka. But then you must know that this is not in the suttas. This is only what they say. For example, when they say that the Buddha transmitted his leadership of the Sangha to Mahakassapa, we find the suttas, this is not correct. Because when the Buddha was about to pass away, Venerable Ananda asked the Buddha, said, Bhagava, after you are gone, whom should we follow as our teacher? And the Buddha said, after I am gone, take the Dhamma and the Vinaya that I have taught as your teacher. So the Buddha did not say that to follow another monk as his teacher. The Buddha said to follow his teachings as the real teacher. Whereas the Mahayana books, they say differently. Now, the Mahayana books also say that at the time of Emperor Asoka, there were only 2 sects of Buddhism. It's only after the time of Emperor Asoka that the 18 other schools formed. But in the Sri Lankan records, the 18 additional schools already formed by the time of King Asoka. Also, it is mentioned in the Sri Lankan records that because of the many wrong views that the King Asoka saw among the monks, that he asked a very respected monk called Mogali Putta Tissa Thera to convene the third council of monks, and then to recite the true Dhamma, and then to tell them what is wrong, what is right. And also those monks who did not follow the true Dhamma, who had wrong views, this Mogali Putta Tissa Thera was asked to defrock the monks, disrobe the monks. So now you would think that if all this happened 100 years after Emperor Asoka's time, if Mogali Putta Tissa Thera tried to disrobe the monks, I don't think they would have allowed him to disrobe. They would probably have fought with him, right? It's only, to my mind, he could only do that because King Asoka directed him to do it. King Asoka was behind him. Because of the king's power, the monks could be disrobed. But if King Asoka was not around, and this happened 100 years later, if any monk tried to disrobe another monk, they would definitely not listen to him, right? So also, it is stated in the Sri Lankan records that the second Sangha Council, where the basic schism happened in Vesali, where the monks of Vesali was not practicing well, and the 700 monks convened the second Sangha Council. It is mentioned in the Sri Lankan records that this happened at the time of King Kala Asoka. In other words, at that time, 100 years after the Buddha's passing away, there was a king called Kala Asoka. And then the third council, which was held during the time of Emperor Asoka, was another 118 years later. So, you see from here that the Chinese records have no knowledge that 2 Asoka or kings existed. They did not know of the existence of Kala Asoka. They only know of one Asoka only. This famous Asoka sometimes is called just King Asoka, or sometimes it is called Dhamma Asoka because he ruled according to Dhamma. So sometimes they call him Dhamma Asoka. So because they did not have this knowledge that there was another Asoka, most probably they confused these two Asokas and thought they were the same person. That's why you find that they say that this all this happened 100 years after the Buddha's passing away. So from here we can see most probably why the Chinese records have it wrong.